Hey guys, welcome to Storytime with Jester. As you can see, it is a different outfit I'd be wearing this time because it is December and I am the Georgia Claus. So, we'll be picking up where we left off last time in the saga of Andor and his companions in Book of Prophecies. Chapter 54. Two dark figures moved slowly down the spiraling staircase that wrapped around a core of jet black. The flameless torch that was being carried by one of the figures gave off a bright radiance that illuminated the purple steps and outer wall. As they descended, the air around them grew colder with each step. So intense was the cold that any flame that may have existed would quickly be snuffed out. Perhaps that was the reason for this special torch. In fact, even the thurible that the second figure swung back and forth, although the incense was lit, gave off no smoke or heat. When they reached the bottom, they entered into what could only be described as a tomb. The room was a circular chamber, void of anything save a large stone block in the center. Lying atop the block was a haze-shrouded figure that seemed to draw all light into it. So black was its form that to gaze at it for mere seconds would cause the viewer to go blind, the antithesis of the sun itself. The two figures wore robes of black that seemed twice their size. The sleeves nearly touched the floor when not being held, and the rope belts seemed to cinch up several feet of material rather than inches. They made their way toward the stone block with heads lowered. One moved to the head of the block and placed a black cone in each of the three torch-like holders and lit them with the torch he carried. Then he moved to the foot and repeated the process. The second figure placed incense balls into 6 holders that had flanked a stone step on the main block. He then took out a torch and lit it with the flame from the first figure's torch, then proceeded to light the incense balls, all the while being careful to hold everything with the sleeves of his robe. He then took out a spiraled horn and, warming the mouthpiece with his torch, sounded it. Behind the pair, a section of wall rumbled as it began to sink. The two turned towards the opening, looked at each other, then one proceeded through. Moments later, he returned holding 2 metal rods. The secret door then rumbled back into place, and he handed one of the rods to his companion. The two then placed the end of the rods in depressions at either end of the step and turned simultaneously, causing the step to slide into the block, revealing an opening underneath. The one figure reached in and pulled out a small black metal box. He felt around it gently as if searching for something before finally lifting the clasp and opening the lid. Inside was a fortune in gems. The other figure pulled out a large bag the shape of a tome. He untied the bag and pulled out a book whose cover was of a black scaly hide. The first figure snatched the bag from the second and quickly gathered up the gems, placing them inside. The second clutched the tome tightly to his chest, and the pair made their way toward the spiral staircase, nearly tripping several times on the hems of their robes. They ascended the staircase with their treasures, relieved to be free of the cold shroud that was nearly their own tombs. Chapter 55. The black-clad warrior reached down in the stream of lava and pulled out a crown of iron, his hand none worse for the wear, not even a singe. He grasped the crown in both hands and held it high in the air triumphantly before lowering it onto his head. His pock-marked face immediately became awash in fire as the crown blazed into life, flames flickering about the warrior's head, causing even his long brown hair to appear on fire, yet no harm came to him. He reached into a bag that was tied to his belt and pulled out what looked to be a large lump of coal at first, until it started to pulsate in his hand like a beating heart, faintly as if it were barely clinging to life. Chapter 56. The Two new owners stood watching the old signage being removed and the new one installed. The dwarf kept giving directions to the workers as to how high, left, right, etc., while his gnome companion had his head buried in a book, furiously scribbling with a quill pen. Finally satisfied with the placement of the sign, the dwarf turned to the gnome and said, "How does it look, Fizz?" The gnome peered over his spectacles at the dwarf, glanced up at the sign, and back down at his book where he continued scribbling. The dwarf sighed and walked into his newly purchased inn, the gnome absent-mindedly following. "I can't believe the old codger gave up so much gold for that tome we found," the dwarf said. "Good fortune, says I," Fizz said. "It will make up for the gems we had to pay for this place. I still don't know what I think about the name. Imp and Satire Inn." Just as the dwarf was about to respond, the door to the inn opened and in walked a group of 6. "Ah, Mal," Fizz said to the dwarf, "our first customers." Chapter 57. The group of heroes, which numbered 8, slowly made their way up the web-filled staircase, using torches to burn away the thick webs, as well as illuminate their way through the mist that filled this darkened place. They finally made it to the top, only to find more of the same throughout the upper level. "What's that horrid smell?" asked Hannah, the lithe little half-elven thief that led the way. Like 2 of her other companions, she hailed from the Greywood. Right behind her was the leader of the group, Pedius, a knight of Hieronymus, and native to Grindamos. Like most knights that swore allegiance to his patron saint, his shield bore the spotted owl clutching a lightning bolt in each talon, a shield that was quickly being covered by the hard-to-burn webs. "It's the webs," he answered, the pungent smell from his shield providing the clue. "It's as if they are rotting," he added. "What the—" Hannah exclaimed, dropping the torch to the ground and halting in her tracks. The torch she just held lay on the ground, warped and discolored. "Something is not right here," said Arafe, the half-elven druid who was also from the Greywood. He knew that under normal circumstances wood would not behave in such a fashion. Suddenly, and without warning, a hole appeared in the wall next to them, and from the darkness a long strand of webbing shot forth and adhered itself to Hannah. With blinding speed her body was snatched through the opening, which closed behind her as suddenly as it had appeared. The attack had been so swift that no one had the time to react, the lot of them barely even fathoming what had just taken place. The group only had one wizard, that being the little gnome Fizzwellian Krogsprocket. As Jamius, a grey elf fighter from the Greywood, tried to batter down the door he hoped led to where his friend had been taken, Pedius tried to get the scatterbrained Fizz to get his nose out of the journal he perpetually was writing in while remaining oblivious to his surroundings, and conjure up a spell to help them get through that wall. He didn't have to wait very long, for a hole appeared in the wall again, but not from anything Fizz had done. Out shot another strand of webbing, this time grabbing Pedius and, just like Hannah before, snatching him through the hole which closed behind him before anyone could react. Pedius found himself in complete darkness. The webbing had thankfully not trapped either of his arms, rather adhering to his back instead. This allowed him to ready his sword. The room was deathly silent, save for the beating of his own heart pounding in his head. He wanted to cry out to Hannah, but figured his call would only attract whatever monster had taken them. Although it probably had no problem sensing him in the dark, it was probably sizing him up right now. From its attack form, and the mass of webbings he and his group had to cut and burn through on the way here, he could only assume his assailant was some sort of spider. Through all of his encounters, he had never battled an arachnid. Sweat beaded on his forehead as the attack that seemed inevitable wasn't coming. Was the creature toying with him? He had heard that demons liked to stalk their prey, feeding on their victims' fears. Was this a demon? Perhaps it was the Spider Queen herself. Why wouldn't it show itself? The awful smell from the corridor permeated the air around him. He shifted his feet to gain better balance. His foot hit something on the floor. Hannah? Slowly, he squatted down, feeling with one hand. He felt something wet and warm. While he stared blankly at his hand through the darkness, he heard something drip on his armor, the glowing liquid hissing upon contact with the metal. Pedius slapped his blood-soaked hand on the hilt of his sword and thrust upward with both hands. As he felt it find purchase, an unholy, ear-splitting scream erupted above him. Their battle raged on for what seemed like an eternity to Pedius, as he had to rely solely on instinct and sound. His body received many slashing wounds from something long and sword-like. He was giving as well as he got, to his account, when suddenly he became awash with a sickening feeling. Was he poisoned? He didn't remember being bitten by the creature. His legs felt weak, his stomach queasy, and his head started spinning. Then it felt as if the entire world was spinning all around him, and then he was falling. Then he blacked out. When he awoke, he was laying on a hard surface. Feeling around, it felt as though it was polished stone. Again, all was dark, and all he could hear was his own heart and breathing. He was alive, for now. Where was the creature? He listened intently, but heard nothing. He still held his sword. He readied it with one hand. Dare he move and chance give his position away? Well, the creature attacked him in the dark before, so if it was here, it probably could already see him. With his free hand, he loosened the straps of his backpack and let it slide to the ground, switching sword hands as needed. He fumbled in the dark to undo the flap and pulled out a torch, flint, and steel. He could tell he was wounded quite a bit. He couldn't afford a surprise attack in the dark, but he had to see what was around him, where he was. With all the courage he could muster, he laid his sword down and went to work lighting the torch. As it shed its first light, the amber glow revealed his enemy just several feet away. Startled, he quickly grabbed his sword and readied himself in a defensive stance. The creature was hideous beyond imagination, evil. It was indeed spider-like in appearance, but something much more, almost alien. Its coloration of dark red, gray, and purple gave it an otherworldly look. He could now see the sword-like weapons were its barbed long legs. Its face was grotesque, something out of a nightmare. Majority of its skull was razor-sharp teeth, with its skin stretched so thin as to look like a membrane. Its eyes had hellish red sclera and pupils as black as the void. It lay there, twitching in its death throes. Pedius laid the torch on the floor and walked slowly over to his adversary. Grabbing the hilt of his sword in both hands and lifting its blade high in the air with the point facing down, he thrust it into the body of the creature with all the strength he had left. The creature let out an eerie hiss as it convulsed and died. Finally able to relax somewhat, Pedius took an account of his surroundings. He was in what looked to be a corridor or passage, with mist covering the walls and ceiling. Or perhaps the mist was the wall and ceiling. Letting his instinct take control, he chose a direction to go and started walking, hoping to find egress from wherever it was he now found himself. Unbeknownst to him, lying partially hidden underneath the creature was Hannah's sword. Even if he had noticed it, its significance would have probably escaped him. Hannah had known its worth, but would have kept it a secret from Pedius. Had he known the magic it possessed while she was alive, he would have probably misused it in some foolish way. Such was the way of Pedius. No, she kept it to herself, and as a result left him oblivious to the only way to get him out of this place and back home amongst his friends and companions. For if he knew its power, he would have only had to pick it up and make a wish. As it was, each step he made took him further and further away from salvation. Ah, but such a fate was not to be. Pedius journeyed but a short while in the misty corridor, fighting off all sorts of arachnids and such type creatures, just a well-placed bite, stinger, or pincher away from never seeing any of his friends again. Battling his way, not knowing what fate waited around the next turn, until finally he came to a door in the mist. Uncertain, but with nothing to gain in passing it up, he slowly turned the knob and pushed open the door. From inside, a tired old voice said, "Ah, a visitor. Come, sit. Learn your fate." It's all in the cards. The cards know. And that, my friends, is where we will finish today's reading. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed reading it to you. Make sure you hit that like, subscribe, and notification bells, and leave any comments in the comment section, because I do love those, and share with all your friends, because the more people you share with, the more people can watch. Make sure also that you pick up my book of Prophecies, by clicking on one of the links in the About section of this channel. It takes you to the hardback, paperback, or ebook formats. That will help me out greatly by you purchasing that, because I do not have a tip jar or a Patreon account. So if you like this channel and want to support it, that's the best way that you can do that for me. And until next time, and as always, see you soon.